Hello, everyone. So I'm delighted to be here because I bloody love this book by Dane Holt, Father's Father's Father. I like a title that feels like it could go on infinitely as well. Fathers, 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 fathers. When I encounter um, new poetry that I love, this strange thing happens in my brain. I look at the page, but I'm not just simply reading words. I'm pulled into this sensory, cinematic, emotional experience that won't let me go until the final line. And then even then, it's going to linger. And these poems do exactly that. They win you over straight away. And every poem has to win you over anew, right? Each page, each poem has a new kind of task to pull you in. And it always does. And once they've got you, Dane can take you anywhere, and he does. The movement of his mind through these poems is this fascinating path, and you can't always retrace the breadcrumbs. Like you think you're going one way, then a door opens, and you've jumped in time. There are swerves and slippages. The place where a tamed poem might end, then the untamed place beyond it. He's constantly playing with the expectations of narrative, setting up, then subverting, being like, oh, you think this is the story? Oh, actually, no. And in fact, line to line, you can't predict what's going to happen or how far you're going to travel from the opening. And yet, and this is what I find so remarkable, nothing is vague or wafty. Every swerve is sharp, and the mystery is this tangible experience. There's a solidity. It's like waking up from a dream, but you can remember it. The umbrella, the tennis court, the coffee machine, the horse. It all feels solid in your mind, even though you could never paraphrase it. There's a quote by a Romanian poet, Lucian Blanca, where he says, our duty when faced with a mystery is not to explain it, but to deepen it, to transform it into a greater mystery. And for me, that's what a Dane Holt poem does. It meets you at the entrance of the wood, and it says, come with me, in this compelling voice, deeper into the mystery, until you're like, what is a man? What is family? What is culture? What is history? Who am I? And that to me is utterly thrilling, and what I, keep coming back to poetry for. I have so much more praise, but I'm going to try and shoehorn that into the Q&A. But I think I should pass over to the man of the hour, which sounds like a Dane Holt poem that he would end in a dark and troubling place. Dane, where are you? Can you come out from the darkness, please, and show yourself?
That was perfectly timed.
Oh,
Thank you so much for that introduction, Caroline. That was really, really remarkable. And I sort of, I was listening to that, and I sort of was listening to it so intently that I assumed that I was in the audience, thinking you were talking about someone else. But no. Thank you so much for that, and thank you to everyone at Carcanet, to Michael, John, Jasmine, and Andrew for putting together this book, which is backwards. I think, as in many ways it is backwards. Um, I'm gonna start with a poem that the title comes from. The first poem that I can remember reading that sort of troubled me and made me want to understand more about the thing was a poem by John Ashbery called At North Farm. And the title comes from that poem. The granaries are bursting with meal. Your father's father's father poisoned a beautiful horse. That's the story. Now you know this. You've opened the door marked family history. Behind it, a man is scratching a name you don't recognize into the ice which surrounds him. His 6 sons burn the memory of 6 brothers as midnight oil. Unhurried as the death of a poisoned horse, and without gesture to each other, they begin to move. They don't have far to go. They travel light, having no horse. As they get closer to you, their backs straighten, their clothes begin to mend. Their faces soften the way faces that have never seen a city at night soften. Soon the father looks the same age as the sons. But the sons are lost in the city. Now this is the story. A father is looking furiously in the city for 6 sons that don't want to be found. I thought that the way to get over the John Ashby poem was just to do it again. And I guess that's what tradition is. Um, the next poem I'm going to read is a poem called Tammy Wynette, but maybe not about Tammy Wynette. Or maybe it's entirely about Tammy Wynette, but mainly about the issues that I have with um, the song Stand By Your Man, which are not issues that are the issues with the song, but the issue is that it's not her best song, and she's certainly not at her best in it, but well, the poem explains it, I think, maybe. Tammy Wynette. The only records found in my grandmother's attic were by scorned women, for scorned women, written by men. Stand By Your Man is, to my ears, the best vocal performance of the worst lyric, which goes to show something, I don't know, something about how saying one thing so exactly to someone intent on hearing the opposite is art. Only once my grandmother told my father, "You don't know what I go through having to live with your father." A storm of bad men could not dampen Tammy Wynette's spirit. I mean her hair. I refused to listen to that song without crying, or at least without the taste of hairspray in my mouth. I had 2 grandmothers, but only one grandfather. The record I have of the other is the day he died and the day of his funeral. My mother missed it. She looked like Tammy Wynette when she told me this, except for her hair. I mean her spirit. First thing they tell you in any creative writing class is do not end the poem on the word spirit, but we persevere. The next poem I'm going to read is called Humphrey Bogart, and I think of this poem and Tammy Wynette as sort of as pairs or being in conversation with each other. I don't know if Humphrey Bogart and Tammy Wynette were ever in conversation, but I would like to know if anyone knows in the chat. Humphrey Bogart. I'm told there was a time when a man could strike a match by running it against the nail of his thumb. When a man could wake up with a cigarette already smoking in the ashtray beside him, get out of bed and shower with one hand washing his body while the other held a cigarette above the shower curtain. Then he could lounge, according to the grandfather who told me, in the shade cast by the brim of a cowboy hat all day if he wanted to, and never hear a bad word said against him. My grandfather never told his son that he loved him. I said this to a group of strangers and then said, "Consider this." His son never asked to be told. They both loved the men Humphrey Bogart played. Neither could forgive the woman played by Katharine Hepburn for throwing the gin overboard while Charlie Ornut slept off the previous night's gin. Something hung between them, my father and his father, like the smoke from every cigarette Humphrey Bogart ever smoked. There was one thing my grandfather could not forgive his son for. Eventually, it was his son's dying, yes. After our parents died, my sister told her daughter that those we loved and those who loved us have not gone away. They're birds now. Consider this. It's August. A child who never knew the names of the birds looks up and the sky is suddenly full of dead people. There and there and there and we'll move on from the family stuff. There's the sort of second half, the book's in sort of 3 parts, and the first part is sort of strange biographies of real and fictional people and uh, my response to them and ideas of family and and communities, and the second half is populated by sort of archetypes or like archetypes of maleness in and masculinity in the culture, and one of those is the sort of noir private detective. And this poem is called "Precious Little Mystery," and it's sort of from the point of view of his assistant. Precious Little Mystery. I'm partnered with LaRue. Bad clam, he's locked himself behind his frosted pane. My job is to stand in the kitchenette, boil and peel eggs when he can't sleep. None of this will bring her back, is all I say, but I hit my cue. His carpet like a patch of dry skin. Despite everything, I do not love him, nor the theories that raise themselves then cancel themselves out, the plots that revolve around him in increasingly vague circles. He'll damn the grey sky of morality before long, and I'll act surprised and concerned about his drinking. The Venus flytrap on the windowsill. The sleek, outmoded telephone doesn't ring without demands. The past sounds like a woman, laughing somewhere back east. She's getting the joke. 5 years, 10 years too late. The next poem, however many however many people have seen the sitcom Scrubs, and there's an image in one of the later season episodes, and I don't think Scrubs invented it because it's sort of like a sort of typical of anxiety dreams in which the Dr. Elliot Reed is holding a plastic cup of coffee under a coffee machine, but the coffee machine won't stop. And this image has followed me around for a long time, and I had to purge it from myself and create sort of a narrative around it, and a narrative of a stress dream after a traumatic incident. So this poem is called Hit and Run. There was the impact and the windscreen shivering like a cobweb in a soft rain. I was briefly outside myself, watching myself on the side of the road. Then I was inside my head, where a coffee machine poured coffee into a brown plastic cup until the cup was full, but the machine continued pouring and the cup overflows. So I look around the empty lobby, airport lounge, hospital ward for a coffee machine maintenance man, or just someone to say, "Oh, this machine is always playing up," and deliver a swift kick to the side of it. But no, I grab another cup before the coffee overwhelms the dimensions of the drip tray, and already this cup is full, and a third cup is found, but I'm balancing the two already full cups, scolding my wrist quite badly while the coffee machine continues producing coffee at a Brazilian rate of production. I woke up, wiped the dust from my eyes. There was a public toilet across the road. I went inside and splashed some water on my face. The water in the sink wouldn't go down. It hung around the plug hole. It looked like documentary footage of a large queue forming outside a soup kitchen in the Great Depression. When I came back out to the street, a small cowboy inside me demanded sarsaparilla. His frisky horse took tiny lungfuls of air. I was hanging on by a thread. That that poem sort of ends with a western, and um but and the next poem is about a western. Before we came on, we were in the virtual green room, and I was saying that I couldn't find my mammoth book of westerns. I eventually did find my mammoth book of westerns because I uh forgot to check who wrote the story that it's mentioned in the next poem, and it was of course Bret Hart, not the wrestler, but the turn of the century uh, writer. I just checked my set list and realized that no, that isn't the next poem. The next poem is projecting my phone number onto the face of the moon, which uh, I was listening to podcast, and on the podcast they were talking about this phone booth in the Mojave Desert, and in the back of a magazine when they used to have magazines with interesting things in the back of them. Uh, a man in America found the number of the Mojave phone booth and thought that it would be funny to the way he put it was to make a phone booth ring in the middle of the desert, and he'd be the only one to know that he'd done this. And this sort of this this idea became a compulsion for him, and he would he said in this interview that he would fall to sleep to the sound of the phone ringing and fall asleep with the noise that he was making a phone ring that would never be picked up. And then, of course, someone picked it up, and it was as sort of a as mundane an encounter as as you could as you could ever want. It was the phone booth was used by a plant somewhere 100 miles away, and they would make their phone calls there at at sort of regular intervals. But there's a poem by Robert Frost called "The Fear" about a man and a wife uh, out traveling in the night by horse and cart, and the wife is convinced that there's someone sort of following them, someone in the bushes walking alongside them, and then the man says, "No, no, no, there isn't," and the wife says, "No, there is," and she turns to the bush, turns to the darkness, and says, "Is someone there? Come out and show yourself." And then, the worst thing that you could imagine is someone responds, and it's just a guy sort of walking with his son. But this poem, I was thinking about instead of making the call, if you allowed yourself and opened yourself up to receive phone calls from everybody, hoping that someone who was beyond communication might get in touch with you after you've sort of exhausted all other avenues. So this is about that. This is called projecting my phone number onto the face of the moon. After the first week, the death threats didn't bother me, not nearly as much as the long intervals of heavy breathing, often during the same call. After a month, I began enjoying the messages from general well-wishers who, they said, didn't understand the impulse but were supportive of the arts. There were night shift workers too, not lonely but abstracted, and hotel suites in the Arctic Circle, which was strange considering the long absence of the moon there. Of the calls that stuck with me, a man in Bavaria wringing the neck of a beloved pigeon. They don't say please in heaven, he said, but they do say thank you in hell. No matter the call and who was on the other end, my one rule was to stay quiet. I almost broke once with a woman from Buenos Aires. She was terminally ill, and her last wish was to waste her final breath. I guess I obliged. After a year, I was ready to give it up. Then the phone rang. What the fuck are you waiting for? She said. I shaved, combed my hair, and checked my jacket pockets for bus fare, for the exact change. Back to the westerns. I think the next poem is Great Grandson. I think I have a yes, it is. So as I said, I was checking my Mammoth Book of Westerns, and The Outcast of Poker Flat is the first story in there, which means I'm a bad researcher. Um, but it was written by Bret Hart, not the wrestler. Um, Great Grandson. In the village hall, the woman holds a bowling ball on a wooden plinth sprayed with marble effect spray paint. My mother bowled a perfect game with this ball, she is telling him. She was the first pregnant woman ever to bowl a perfect game, at least according to the Hall of Records. She was pregnant with me. Please take it, please. Get it out of my house. The appraiser considers the ball and the marble effect plinth and takes it from her. The woman has to be escorted out of the hall. Such are the dimensions of her relief. The appraiser takes another lap of the hall. He seems to be interested in the clay pipe you're holding. Yes, it's drawn his attention all right. He's approaching you. He's readying his loop. Yes, there's a scene engraved along the length of the stem of the pipe. A western? Yes, it's the outcasts of Poker Flat. There's the dilapidated cabin in arresting detail, visible through the snowstorm. And there on one side of the bowl is a playing card, the two of clubs, on which is inscribed, "Beneath this tree lies the body of John Oakhurst, who struck a streak of bad luck on 23rd of November 1850 and handed in his checks on the 7th of December 1850. And on the other side, there he is beneath the tree, John Oakhurst, shot through the heart. John Oakhurst was my great grandfather, says the appraiser. He's shaking. I have a blank check here with your name on it. Take it, he says. Old man, your money's no good here, you tell him. In the middle of the book, there are seven versions of poems by the Russian poet Sergei Yesenin or Yesenin. Um, they are not translations. I do not speak Russian. But I can remember reading a few of his poems translated into English and really liking the poems, but really disliking the translations because he seems a lot angrier than people sort of uh, willing to willing to give him credit for when they turned it into sort of polite English rhymed quatrains, sort of like Russian Catullus, sort of hating and loving and anger and tender in equal measure. So I'm going to read two of those poems. The first one is number two. They don't tend to have titles, but I think this one is called "Letter to His Mother," so I call it that. Mother, are you still alive? I'm alive. I see that unspeakable light of evening bathing your little blue house. They write me, telling me you're worried almost to death, that you make tracks in the road with worry, back and forth in your housecoat. I know you. In the blue darkness you see, because I see the same thing, me in a pub brawl with some 6'4" Finn's knife puncturing my chest. Don't worry, kind mother, it's a bad dream, nothing more. I'm not so beyond the pale I'll die without seeing my best girl first. Besides, I'm gentler now than I was as a lad. I dream only the one dream, returning to our little blue house once this rebellious rage runs its course. I'll return when the branches spread with spring, our white garden. Only don't get me up at the crack of dawn like you did last time I came home. What was it? 8 years ago? Let me lie, and let lie all those dreams you and father had for me. Don't dig them up and out of the ground and show me their faces. They've been following me since I left you. And please don't force me to kneel and pray, please. There's no going back to that. You alone are my life's joy, you my unspeakable light. So, mother, don't worry about me. And don't let them see you worrying tracks in the road, back and forth in your housecoat. And the second one is number three, which I don't think has a title. It is right, in autumn's first freshness, to let the wind shake the soul's apple tree a little, and watch the yellow farmer plough the vast blue lake. And it is right and good to pull from one's body the nail glowing red hot with song, put on white festive clothes, and wait for the guest to arrive. I am learning with the heart, the colour of the cherry tree honoured in my eye. Only austerity sharpens feeling in the ribs. The stars like bells ring. Each leaf is a candle for the birds to put out. I won't let anyone enter my room. I won't answer the door. Um, these are my last two poems for this portion of the evening. I'd like to thank everyone for being here. Thank you. Means a lot that you would spend the evening listening to me. Um, can't read what Mick McGee's put into the chat, but I'm sure it's going about something. I'd like to thank I don't want to go over the acknowledgements, but uh, a lot of people have helped with this book, and a lot of those people are online now, and the book wouldn't exist without them, and well, it might do, but it wouldn't be as good. So this penultimate poem is called "The Sky, a Toothache Shade of White." Thank you, Michael. You're not one of them. You are. Uh, Building the ice hotel hardly seems worth it. In the foyer, clear, opaque, damier pattern tiles balance grandeur and its synonyms perfectly. Distinguished sculptures weep their tangled beards. We tortured Mr. Incumbent by entering the anteroom with purpose, only to forget what we'd come in for. He looked up from his ottoman with a face like currency, won and lost all night across a deal table. The campaign was not without a certain brio. Those in the valley stayed put, convinced our dams were what ancient engineers dreamed possible. When the fighter jets made a break for it, through the thick clouds of volcanic ash, we knew time was a factor among factors. Friends, once the wounds have healed, we shall reflect, collate our good deeds and our bad, and these shall form our mountain ranges, our tragic skyline. The flood shall irrigate our tennis courts by God. A drop of water runs down a seam in the ice cathedral dome, like word from the mountain, any day now. And the last poem is the final poem in the book, called "A Line from Merwin." I hadn't planned that, but I guess first poem had uh, a line from a significant poem, and the book ends with a certain line from a W.S. Merwin poem, uh, which I say in the poem. So no need to say now, but thank you all for listening to me, and I'm gonna read this and take a big swig of Guinness. Uh, a line from Merwin. W.S. Merwin writes, I could do anything about the year both his parents died. What do you make of that? I wonder what the nurse who carried the dose of mercy to our mother did for the rest of her shift, if she paused to think about her hands on the steering wheel. We could do nothing for our mother. I held her pulse at arm's length. I couldn't smoke, not for fear I'd miss the instant one breath failed to follow another, but for fear the smell of smoke would make my sister think our father's ghost was there to collect his wife. The part of me that wishes I was that ghost is not the part of me that wants to get through this cigarette alive. This cigarette burns like a single autumn. I could do anything. I could do anything. I could do anything. What do you make of that? The answer can be nothing. Thank you very much.
Mix put in the chat. What a poem! What a bloody poem! I agree. How are you feeling, Dane? That was amazing.
Yeah, oh, thank you very much. Thank you. I was generally sort of knocked sideways by the introduction, and I was generally unprepared to speak after that, because I was thinking, no, there's no way that those words can be related to the the thing that I set out to do. But
Oh,
thank you very much. Thank you for that.
thank you very much. Oh, I want to add, so we just launch in and try
Yes, go
to
for it.
forget we're being watched. So in the reading, when you said introduce the Tammy Wynette poem, you said, oh, it's about Tammy Wynette, but it's not really about Tammy Wynette. And I'm really interested in this idea that a poem both wants to confess and hide simultaneously, right? And this idea that we might bring in characters as kind of like surrogates, almost like, oh, I'm going to write about this character, but it's actually a way of writing about this thing over here,
Mhm.
this person over here, you know. And yeah, is that how the experience of it was bringing in, all of these people into the book as a way of, yeah. Do you know what my question is?
Yeah, I think so. I've been thinking about this. I was I was asked to write something for like a, an online therapy website, and I was thinking about it, and I was like, the book is so like full of like misdirection and indirection, that whatever I'm doing is seems to run sort of counter to the good work that people who are dealing in directness does. And there are lots of um, you know, poems that deal with things very directly, and I admire them because I can't do it. I think like the best line in all of Hamlet is when he's setting up the play, with misdirection by indirection we'll find direction out. So if you go the wrong way
Yeah.
to get to the other thing, and that's what those figures like Tammy Wynette and Humphrey Bogart and John Cena and all that sort of stuff, which seems maybe like sort of when I was starting out the book, I was having fun writing those poems because I thought these seem really frivolous, and the subjects seem sort of frivolous, and then if you can break down people's sort of ideas about whatever I'm talking about with these cultural figures that they might know, then you can get them, at the end.
Well,
Because I, mm,
also, I mean that for me, that's what I think. There's a point in the book where you say, "I wish my poems were sad," and
mm,
for me, the poems are deeply, deeply sad. And one of the reasons they're so sad is because there's this constant misdirection and swerving. It's like the pain is so intense. Of course, you can't stay on it for a long period of time. You have to duck away and swerve around
mm.
it, which feels very true to me, or at least how I feel about pain is like, okay, I'm gonna I'm gonna look you in the eye for a second, and then I'm gonna look away. And is that when as you're going through it, because often sometimes you'll have a swerve just line to line as
Mm.
well. I mean, and is that how it felt when you were writing it? Like you kind of going, oh, I'm here, I'm gonna go that way, like line to line, or
I, I don't I that's the effect that you sort of try to get in the finish. But in terms of the actual writing, I I sort of have like an image or something, or a line or something very very vague, and I don't feel that the way that I write best is by pushing it, but to let things sort of accrue and orbit around it, and then working with sort of this massive stuff and seeing if there's like a through line. And I think through that process, the swerves sort of come naturally, and then it's just a case of sort of making the swerves interesting or surprising or
yeah.
unsurprising or in that sort of way. But I never ever intend to sort of I never intend to know what the juxtapositions are or the sort of the movement between them. I'm always surprised by them, most sometimes pleasantly.
And that's what creates the surprise in the reader is and another thing I love that you do is often you'll set up like something quite cinematic, like what's that poem that begins with, oh, they're here, she said, all morning she'd been stationed on the roof, invite them in, I said. Right, and we think just from that first three lines we think, oh, okay, there's a particular story about to begin, and then you jump forward in chronology immediately, and you're like, when I saw her again, she denied we'd ever met, ever loved. Did you enjoy kind of like, yes, setting up a particular scene and then deliberately jumping forward or destroying it? Because it really,
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Yeah. And a lot of that is from sort of narrative fiction and the short story writers that I like, most like Amy Hempel and Richard Brautigan, people like that who sort of Amy Hempel has a line in an essay in which she talks about wanting her writing to be all lift off and no runway. That's sort of immediate, and that's that. To use a sort of another analogy, that gets rid of sort of like the connective tissue of a lot of narrative, and I wanted that in poems because I think that the poetry is sort of like the natural arena for that sort of getting rid of all that sort of narrative grammar. You can just go from one thing to there was I can remember there was a lecture given by or a reading given by Matthew Sweeney, who's a big influ influence on the book about a poem that he was reading called "The Blue Taps," which is about someone leaving him some blue taps. It's a mad sort of Matthew Sweeney poem. And after he was reading this poem, a novelist came up to him and said, "You poets, um, the poem ends with something like, I hope the blue taps fitted." And this woman said, who was a novelist, said to him, "You poets, if that was a novel, I would have to say whether or not the blue taps fitted. You can't end a novel on you hope the central narrative event, you know, occurs." And Matthew Sweeney was like, "Well, I can, let's I chose.
Yeah,
So I like that idea.
I do. You don't have to begin anything and you don't have to tie anything up.
No, and I'm naturally very lazy.
Well, I don't think that's
So,
me, but I love that thing about all lift off and no runway, because it fits into the question I was going to ask you next, which is about first lines, right? Because like you have so many amazing ways into your poems. Like everything at Martha's party smelled of poison. Bam. The Doncaster wagon arrived before midnight. Bam. The liberation of the fishing ports became history. And did those first lines arrive fully formed and you stepped through them, or did you have to find those first lines, and or did you write a runway and then cut it sometimes?
yes, to all of them.
Yeah.
They some like rarely, on the sort of on the blessed days, you get the first line and okay, this first line is it interests me and it hopefully interests the reader, and it's not just a runway. Hopefully it's just a takeoff, or it's just the 100 meters. It's not the warm up and all the training that goes into the 100 meters. And those sometimes those first lines in draft form end up occurring in line 12 or line 6, and the poem's not working, and usually what the issue for my poems when they don't work is that the first line is somewhere else in the poem. Sometimes the last line, you know the last line of the poem doesn't have to be the most sort of it doesn't have to be sort of like a blockbuster, I don't think. Sometimes the first line can sort of do the work of what a traditional last line would do, maybe. But they're the rare instances where you get it right, which is few and far between.
And definitely is that thing I was when I was talking about at the beginning, about how your poems like win the reader over. There's this sense of sometimes it will be the image of the first line, but it's also you have this, each poem does an incredible things with tone. Like the often when the poem is being it's most mysterious, the tone will sound incredibly certain, which kind of what's that philosopher like Frederick Schiller talks about the watchers at the gates of the mind that are
Mm.
always there at the gates being like, no, that's weird, you can't come in. But you frame a sentence in such a way that like tricks those watchers, and sudden and we absorb the line before we realize that it's weird. You'll start like, yeah, last night Joe told me, or uh no use to us now, or I'm told there was a time, or like a you you phrase it as if you are making complete sense and telling us something we've heard before, and then you've tricked us, and then you can take us somewhere deeply mysterious. I just think it's this amazing sleight of hand that you do with this conversational tone. Where's my question? Do you do that on purpose? Do you enjoy doing that?
No, it's all. I think those. What I like about that effect when it works, and you're very kind to say that it does work, is usually in those poems the dramatic element. When people speak in the book and are very sure, that's when I think that they've sort of misunderstood the situation.
Yeah.
You know, like in the poem about your building the ice hotel. They sort of torturing this guy who wants to be president or something. Whatever the narrative is, and the person who speaks at the end is so sure of the situation while the world is ending. And I think elsewhere, whenever people have that sort of declarative tone, that's when they're most sort of vulnerable because they've either willfully misunderstood the situation or they've misunderstood the sort of the emotional core of the situation. I think that that was what I was certainly trying to do in sort of the dramatic world of the poems.
Yeah, and it really works because you have that authoritative tone, and then suddenly they're just slipping. Things are happening to them they didn't expect, uh, and yet the reader is also pulled along by that, like that conversational certainty. The other thing I want to ask before, but I know we have to go to the Q&A, but so you have all these characters in the book, but you also have all these different speakers in the book. Like sometimes you'll be like sound like a jaded office worker. Sometimes you'll sound, you're a gruff wrestler. Sometimes you're a kind of Russian poets full of woe. Sometimes you sound like an authoritative like mayor, right? And all of these different kind of selves that are being communicated through the eye. Um, well, yeah, what was it like to embody all these different versions of the eye?
It's yeah, it's I think that's something that was it seemed to come quite late because there were poems in which I know because well, I think I know because I wrote them that are me, but they aren't necessarily the ones that you might sort of suspect. And I quite like that because you can sort of I think that the more vulnerable poems in the book are obviously in character, and I like that sort of idea of I wanted the sort of I wanted the everyday and and the and the surreal to sort of be soluble in that way to sort of to go into each other and have these sort of crossovers of fiction and reality sort of always talking at cross purposes. Does that make sense? Like I just I wanted it to sound interesting.
No, no,
And
it
I wanted
definitely
it to
does,
sort
and
of
I
be,
and I
you
and
know,
I love the idea that the thing, often the poems that are closest to yourself
mm,
appear to be the ones most in character.
yeah,
It comes back to that thing of wanting to hide and confess simultaneously. It's like if I find the right disguise, I can tell people everything, and they'll never know.
yeah, yeah.
I'll never know, and that kind of creates the invention, doesn't it? And then suddenly, right, I've noticed no one's put a question in the Q&A yet. Is it because they're listening too hard to you, Dane?
I
Okay. But someone put a question in the Q&A. Um, but in whilst we're waiting, I'm going to ask my favorite question, which is the thing I geek out about. Like, how long did it take you to order the book? And did you have a game or a thing? Because you put a book in poetry book in different orders. It's a whole different book. Did you
yes.
stick them to
Um,
the ceiling? Did what happened?
the old way of just I don't know, putting them on the floor and rolling a dice over them and all that. So yeah, just you try and sort of you try. I think you try and make a narrative, and then talking to John McAuliffe was like, it's not a book of poems is not a narrative.
Yeah.
It's sort of things occur here and there, and then they reoccur sometimes. It's I think he sort of described it more in terms of sort of visual art than narrative fiction and how sort of colors work together. Saying that, I had an order, and John McAuliffe was like, no, no, and then helped me a lot to do that. But he was better at it than I was. So the book, if it was in a different order, it would have been like I do think that at some point the last poem was the first poem, and I think if I read that poem and if I would, ooh, this is sort of this is a different thing than having a poem about a wrestler.
That's so interesting because you know you could say probably that last poem is the one that feels most like, I mean, as you say, it might be a sleight of hand, but it's the one that feels most like the poet is looking you directly in the eye. And there's something very powerful about starting with the poem with, is you pronounce it John Cena or Senna?
Cena, yeah, like a soft C.
John Cena poem, which is you know, you've got the character, the surrogate character
Mm.
in there, and it starts, you know, with a swerve, and then the book journeying to that point where suddenly it's staring down the barrel of itself. Oh, Ian's got a question. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
He likes the idea of hidden confession. Some of the pacing reminded me of Charles Simic. Which poets are you most influenced by?
Uh, I think there's a lot of not. I do like John Ashbery, and I admire John Ashbery in all sorts of ways. But he's when I first started to read John Ashbery at second year university, I think I even then I could be like, oh no, if you write like this guy, you're in for like a world of trouble. He's like infectious and not in like I don't think he can be infectious in a good way. I don't know, maybe. So I was sort of like, but then when I came to do a master's, I started to Tony Harrison would be, the one at university who allowed allowed things to happen, and Simon Armitage and Jeff Hattersley, and people from like my neck of the woods are obviously always important. Caroline, yourself, and then sort of those like Americans like James Tate and Mary Ruefle and Terence Hayes and Diane Seuss and all those sorts of people who can sort of they seem able to sort of encompass like history and form and narrative and confession and character and voice and all those things that I wanted to do. I found in those Americans. Charles Simic, I didn't read a Charles Simic poem, I think, until I'd finished this book. And then I read Charles Simic poems and I was like, I maybe it was a good job I didn't read this guy, because I think the poem might have been twice as long with a load of Charles Simic rip-offs. Instead, it's just full of James Tate rip-offs. Or,
Just like
or
my
versions, as we have to call them.
Angela King says, "How did you get to direction? How did you get to direction from misdirection in a poem? Should you get to direction anyway?" Kind of
That's
wind
yeah,
down picture to
that
that.
would be the perfect poem. I think that was just full of misdirection, but wasn't annoying. Because I think in my head, like, maybe you don't need to get to direction. No, I think Angela is right. There's no need to get to direction. As long as there's a direction in sight, you don't have to arrive there, I think.
But there's a whole journey that happens.
Mm.
Misdirection just means that you don't go down that path, right? It doesn't mean you don't go anywhere.
Yes, yeah, yeah, very
In fact, you
true.
can go much further. I mean, in that poem about where it starts with the father poisoning the horse, you
Mm.
misdirect, you go through you open a door, and then suddenly you're back in time, and then so the poem can actually go further
Yeah,
because it's misdirected. It doesn't just carry on with a story about poisoning a horse, which could only take you so far.
yeah. No, I think you're totally right. I think yeah, I was confusing direction with arrival, and yeah, hopefully they never get to where they. I hope they never get to where they intended to get to. Hopefully there's something else happens along the way that sort of, like every good fairy tale,
Mm.
you sort of end up waylaid in that way.
What did you say? You should never get to the place where you intended to arrive. So the which I suppose is the only way of actually having to for want of a less grand term, like an epiphany of any kind.
Hmm.
Is the poem can't end up telling you what you already know.
Yeah, I hope so. I would certainly never. I don't think I've ever sort of set out with a full journey in mind, knowing where I would begin and then having an idea of where I would get to and then actually getting there. I think that would be sort of. I think that'd be difficult to write. I don't think I'd be sort of able to do that. I wouldn't be able to sort of finish that piece of writing because it would seem already sort of compromised in some way.
You talked about James Tate, and James Tate said this thing about, he said, as soon as I start to have an idea where the poem should go, I immediately want to destroy that plan,
Yeah.
you know, and so there's misdirection, and there's also like line by line deliberate sabotage almost, but sabotage as a kind of creative act of, oh, the poem started going that way, I'm going to deliberately undercut that.
Yeah, like for Tate, I think it was part of like a sort of wider project of a sort of American surrealism. And those early poems, I sometimes that gets a little bit that sort of it clogs my palate that a little bit sometimes. But the later things where they're narrative,
Mm.
and it's the narrative that becomes the principles of narrative that become uh up in the air, as opposed to sort of the level of language itself. Because those early Tate poems, you could sort of it seems to me sometimes like you could take lines out and put them into another poem, and it would the effect would be the same. And I guess it's like a wider project. That's quite interesting, But I like narrative, and I like to feel like I'm going somewhere, even if it wasn't the place that I bought the ticket to.
Yeah, I love that. Talk to me about like influences that aren't poems. So you've got your giant book of westerns you talked about.
Yeah, the Mouth Book of Westerns. Yeah,
What else do you
they
throw
never
into
leave me.
the cauldron?
There's a decent amount of there's a decent amount of country music in there, I think, or enough country music to be going on with. A little bit of a lot of just weird endeavors or stuff that I really liked as a kid, which when I moved to when I went to university and started reading poems and writing about poems, I thought uh, couldn't coexist. So like the poem about the bodybuilders in the parking lot, that came from a documentary I saw about steroids, and the guy who was doing the documentary interviewed this fella who lived in the parking lot of Gold's Gym, and he was sort of convinced that like a sort of person who's a waiter in LA, that if someone sees his script, he's going to make it big. And this guy was like 16. You're like, mate, like, like there's no more Rambos being made. There's no and that sort of that I can't really describe what it is, but it's just people who are sort of not like delusional, but have this sort of drive for something that is ultimately beyond them. That yeah that yeah that sort of thing, and like there's a lot of wrestling in there, and poem about a crooked spire, which is in from the town where I'm from, and yeah, uh,
It strikes me like a voice like that, like if you give the poem a delusional voice, or a voice, as you were saying earlier, that doesn't doesn't actually thinks they know what's going on but
mhm,
doesn't, that also creates a potentially big mysterious journey for the poem, isn't it? Because the speaker doesn't enter the poem in a place of enlightenment.
mhm.
Often the speaker knows the least, and then things get more mysterious from there on.
Yeah, that's like a type of irony, isn't it? It's been a while since I read you know types of ambiguity or whatever that book is, but I think that was one of them in which you know Sophocles doesn't Sophocles knows less than you, and that's like the ultimate, isn't it? Like someone who's so sure of their position in the world, and the audience, you want to scream at him and say no, like it's all going to go wrong. That's where sort of a lot of those poems are sort of from, in that people are so sure of their position in the world, because it's like most of the speakers are male, and are either have this power that they think is going to be eternal, or in a secure place in the community, and ultimately the book, if it's doing anything, is trying to show that all those things are tenuous, and the self is, tenuous, and but hopefully not as sort of, as grand as that. But yeah, to show that things like community and masculinity and all those sorts of things that are seen as default are actually constructed and therefore can be sort of taken away from you pretty easily.
And that's also what creates such pain in the book, as well as the sense that the speakers are not protected somehow, or they think they're protected but they're not.
Mm.
There is a real like a rising peril often in the poems, which I love. Any more questions from anybody? How much do you geek out about line breaks? Because your line breaks are excellent.
Less than I used to, but I think that might just be like Joe, like, I don't know, I'm trying to think. The first time that you're playing pool and you screw back and you screw back, straight, like straight the way that you come back. And the first time you do it, you're like, oh, that was really good. And then you practice, and it becomes like a tool as opposed to like the thing you want to do all the time. So you have to sort of know when to deploy it. Because like sometimes line breaks can be too good,
Yeah,
or,
exactly.
or too obvious, or too sort of signposted to say, look at me.
Or they don't fit with the, if you've got
Yeah.
a vulnerable, messy speaker, you don't want to give
Mhm.
them like really brilliant line breaks necessarily.
Yeah, so like a
You get that
thing that I
balance.
used to think about all the time, but hopefully now is like sort of uh the amount of time that I've been thinking about it doesn't show in the finish in the finish. Yeah.
No, I think that's one of the things I think is so brilliant about the line breaks is they often seem to work accidentally, even though obviously they're not accidents.
Well, you never know. It might all be an accident. It might all just be an accident. You can't say for sure.
I can't say for sure. All right. Well, I think that takes us up to um 8 o'clock. Is that when we're yeah, there we are. It's thank you, Dane. Like
No,
I could carry on flinging questions at you for another half an hour. But
well, if
yeah,
it
I
if
love
it went
that
on any
so
longer, I would be asking you questions. So luckily
much.
for you, you can go. But thank you so much, that Caroline, and thank you, Jasmine, and everyone. Thank you.